theology in our congregations and in our lives. Number 1, always ask why. Never plan anything just on the basis of what are we going to do. Always include the question, why are we doing this? Ask if those two parts fit together. This is how we keep root and branches connected, and how we know if the patterns of our actions reflect something of God. Number 2, we teach from our actions. And so the way we share our message speaks as loudly as the message itself. The church we grow will learn all the good and bad habits of its leadership, and probably more deeply than the words that are actually spoken. So always compare the message being shared with the method of its sharing. If the two are telling a different story, then the message will be damaged. Number 3, check if your message is true. If the message of faith being shared is at odds with the world around, then ask why. It may be because the world around needs to change to respond to the message, or it may be that the message being shared needs to be corrected. If the created world reflects God, then it's not all sin out there and all good in here. The message we share may well challenge the behaviour of people around us and challenge how they see the world. Yet it should not be at odds with reality, and it should equally offer challenge to ourselves as to others. There is only one creation, and all its internal patterns will be self-similar, not made from separate designs. Number 4, make actions as specific to the context as possible, but make the reasoning universal. Presume that if something is true in one place, then its reasoning for being true is true everywhere. If it is true at one level of organisation, then it should be true at all levels, even when it does not appear to be so. God's plans are universal, but they may appear very differently in different situations. Where there are things that seem true in one place and not in another, it is because we are looking at the outward expression of that truth, not the inner reason. If the inner reasoning does not match, then a mistake has been made somewhere. Contrary to the beliefs of most congregations, every village, town or city is both equally unique in outward expression and equally similar to the others in terms of the underlying reasons for those differences. Number 5, recognise that nothing is complete. Fractal patterns can never be perfect in this world, and even within the biggest computer, its shape cannot be calculated to an infinite level. So everything we do is moving towards that perfection, but never gets there. This is not a mistake. It is part of God's plan. Therefore, we should neither despair at our lack of perfection, nor should we pretend that everything is as good as it could be. Being incomplete reflects creation and shows that we are alive. Number 6, recognise that the Bible contains fractal patterns. The scriptures offer stories, parables, sayings and instructions that speak about God's inner reasoning. These outweigh the importance of biblical rules based on the outward behaviour of people, or the outward expressions of those inner ideas. The outward behaviour rules are more tied to situation. They are less perfect and less universal. This idea is clearly expressed in Matthew 22:37-40. In these verses, Jesus talks about our love for God and our love for each other as if it should be the central fractal pattern of all our theology. This is also what God seems to be telling us through the prophets when we hear about a law that is written on our hearts. It is also at the root of many disputes between Jesus and the Pharisees. The Pharisees are able to twist the rules of outward behaviour to their own advantage, whereas Jesus wants them to look at the inner reasoning that is true and just for all people. Number 7, recognise that numbers tell a vital part of our story, but we need to learn to read that story properly. Congregations should never simply be measured on the basis of how many turn up on a Sunday morning. Small numbers do not necessarily mean a congregation is failing, but stagnation at any scale is self-similar to death. Sharp decline may tell us that there is a problem, but not what the problem is. It is an outer expression of an inner issue. Not all growth is good. A congregation that grows rapidly from a flawed message, a message that is shared in an unethical way, or from an organisation that is not prepared for this large change, can become like a cancerous growth, unhealthy and dangerous to itself and others around. Good growth is about the transformation of individuals and communities towards being more Christ-like. Measuring this is not simple and cannot be done just by adding up the numbers of people. Rather, it can be done by recognition of patterns and perhaps counting the ways in which those patterns are being expressed. Number 8. Events work well with big numbers, but discipleship only works with small numbers. We see this in the feeding of the 5,000 and the calling of the 12. Luke's gospel shows Jesus to be using a pattern of leadership with a ratio of 1 or 2 to 12. We see this in the sending out of the 12 and of the 72. The 2 to 12 ratio for discipleship keeps relationships close, keeps stress low, and keeps leaders safe in pairs. That ratio can be repeated at many, many levels of scale in our organisations, from local groups right up to national institutions and international groups. Number 9, putting things in perspective. Fractals have levels of scale or iteration, and in fractal theology it is sometimes useful to think about how we might break information up into useful levels of iteration, such as local, national or global. Or, for example, as a Methodist, I often think about levels of connection, district, circuit, congregation and individual members. It's useful to ask whether the fullest iterations of church coincide with those specific levels, or whether they fall somewhere in between those levels. Also, this method might help us to put bits of theology into hierarchies of iteration. This is not necessarily to say that one is more important than the other, but to ask which ones are dependent on others and how they relate to each other. For example, it's useless having a theology of how we treat church building assets if we don't also have a theology of the environment. A well-maintained chapel on a dead planet is of little use to anyone. Number 10, putting things in balance. Congregations can get easily out of balance. It's easy to spot when a congregation is mostly elderly, mostly young, mostly women, etc. It may not be quite so obvious just by looking at a congregation that it has become mostly introverts, mostly active practical workers, or mostly evangelists. There are several ways of making those kinds of division, but it's useful to pick some categories and find a method of assessing a congregation's balance. Knowing that there is an imbalance doesn't necessarily solve the problem, but it will help to explain some of the problems that a congregation has, and it will help that congregation to look for ways to reset those imbalances and rebalance their ways of attracting people. Number 11, learn to embrace the abstract. Christians are often committed to a life of practical service, and rightly so. But in any healthy Christian community, there needs to be people who can think about the ideas behind the practice, to think about the underlying reasoning, and to ask the questions that busy practical people don't have time to ask. More importantly, perhaps, we need to give them space and time to be heard. Because those who struggle with the abstract often struggle to hear those who speak in concepts and ideas. Also, those who struggle with the abstract often mistake simple for simplistic. Simplistic is easy but often wrong. Simple is usually the result of much deep thought and patient observation. Avoiding elitism and being accessible to all people is something that is deeply Christ-like. But mistaking that for willful ignorance and reverse snobbery is dangerous and is disturbingly common. Not everyone can process all the information and ideas needed to be able to map out fractal patterns. However, we can train our instinctive sense of what is beautiful to recognize the shapes and patterns that echo God's call to love and to justice for all humanity. Number 12, be prepared to adjust your thinking. Sometimes we encounter people from other cultures, religions, and even from our own who see the world differently. It is the same created world and its truths are universal. Others may have seen something from another perspective that may help enrich our view. The question should not be who is right and who is wrong, but rather what underlying truth connects these two different perceptions. Number 13, be prepared to adjust your plans. Sometimes the results of what we do are not what was planned. This may be because our pattern is wrong, but it may also be because there are many variables that we don't understand. People tend to assume that the connection between a plan and its results are a straight line. Fractals remind us that most things exist in a far more complex state of chaos. But if we are paying attention, we can see patterns within the chaos. It would be impossible to understand how every variable affects the outcomes of our plans, but what we can do is observe the effect of adjusting little things. Perhaps more importantly, we should become more aware of the difference between the surface adjustments that suit particular people's preferences and changes to the underlying reasons. Both may need to change from time to time, but we need to know the difference between the two. Number 14, be prepared to expand your universe. Not only are there people out there with different religions and ideas, but there is also an entire universe out there with a vast amount of stuff that we don't yet understand. There are many scientists working to better understand our universe, and it's vital that our theology does not deny science or try to create divisions between those aspects of truth. If Christ was there from the beginning of creation, then our view of salvation and our understanding of the universe should also be understood as part of one single pattern of action by God. A good fractal theology should be one that prepares us to live way beyond the narrow traditions of our past, but knows how to learn the universal wisdom gained from those traditions.